Welcome back, Capital F football fans, to the O&O Sports YouTube channel. Today, we are going over some of the most overrated programs in the country heading into 2026. Last week, we talked about some teams that I was high on that I think a lot of people are sleeping on early in this offseason. But today, we are flipping the scripts. We're looking at teams that I am not high on going into next season. As always, be sure to like and subscribe if you do enjoy the content. It helps me out a lot. And without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into it. Starting off with some controversy, it is the Alabama Crimson Tide. Now, just hear me out, Crimson Tide fans. I know the slander is palpable, but just hear me out, trust me. Just 57% of your snaps returning overall from last season. Not a ton of returning production from a team that was pretty successful last year. They take major hits on the offensive line, including Caden Proctor, Dewberry, Parker Brailsford, Roberts, four very, very good offensive linemen, as well as their quarterback, Ty Simpson. They lose his safety blanket at tight end, Josh Cuevas. They lose their best running back, in my opinion, from last season in Jam Miller. They lose a ton of playmakers on the front seven, including LT Overton, Tim Keenan, Nikai Hill-Green, Deontay Lawson, Justin Jefferson. So all that is to say, they lose a ton of last year's squad. And I think when you lose that kind of production, it is very hard to necessarily upgrade. They are still obviously very, very talented from a roster perspective. They revamped both lines, but it's going to be a bit of a band-aid season. And with the adjusted offensive line and them being just bad at running the ball last year, I don't think they necessarily take a step forward. I think they might improve a tiny bit. I just don't see Alabama in its current iteration taking a major step forward in terms of running the ball. And on top of that, the quarterback situation is still a bit of a mystery. Austin Mack is the more tenured in the program, but if you have offensive line struggles, you're going to want a mobile guy like Keelan Russell. And on top of that, naturally with being in the SEC, they have a very, very tough schedule this year, especially in October. Georgia at home, on the road versus Tennessee for the third Saturday in October, at home versus Texas A&M. They also play Kentucky on the road, LSU on the road, Vanderbilt on the road, which is the game they lost a couple years ago. There is a ton of volatility around this program going into year 3 with Kalen DeBoer, which doesn't give me a ton of hope for them. I project their preseason win total to be 9.5 to 10.5, somewhere around that range, and I project them to have 8 or 9 wins in 2026. And next, jumping to the Big Ten, it is the Illinois Fighting Illini. I know you might be thinking, who really is high on Illinois? But they've been very, very solid the past couple seasons. They've been an efficient team with a lower-ish ceiling. And in my opinion, one of the more underrated quarterbacks in football, and Luke Altmaier, who was a dynamic playmaker for this offense last season. They replace him this year with Katon Hauser, who is also dynamic, but a touch less efficient. And on top of that, they lose a ton of production on offensive line. They do replace it with experience, but I wouldn't necessarily say they got better overall as an offensive line, maybe as good, maybe a step below where they were last year. On top of that, they also were not very solid at running the ball, just 3.8 yards per carry, which was in the bottom half of the country last season. Now, I do think Brett Bielema has put this squad in a good position to win kind of games they might not be expected to, being a program like Illinois, who is not a super brand-friendly team in the Big Ten. I think they often play above their expectation, but overall, I think they're pretty average. They're generally efficient, but not explosive, not super dominant in one area or the other. But if you have been watching college football, you have noticed that Illinois has won 9+ games in the past 2 seasons. But if you take a closer look, these are pretty lenient schedules they're doing this on. In 2024, their preseason win total was 5.5 games. They started 6-3, which is very good. They obviously surpassed that preseason win total, which was very low. And then in November, their last 4 games were Minnesota at home, Michigan State at home, at Rutgers, and Northwestern. And then in 2025, their preseason win total jumps up to 7.5. They start 5-3, and then their November slate, once again, very, very easy. Rutgers at home, Maryland at home, at Wisconsin, and then Northwestern again. So they have had a pretty easy route to success, in my opinion, in November. This season, however, I expect their preseason win total to probably take another step up, perhaps to an 8.5, 9.5 win range, just because, like I said, they have had back-to-back 9+ win seasons the past 2 years. Pre-November, they faced teams like Duke in the out-of-conference, at Ohio State, and Oregon at home, which obviously are not easy games. And then in November, November, they face Nebraska at home, at UCLA, which is very interesting considering they just got Bob Chesney. They play Iowa at home, is always a tough play, and then they go to Northwestern. There are no byes in November. They've had byes the past 2 years. So with them taking what I believe to be a slight step back on offense, as well as a less lenient schedule, especially in November overall, I project them to go around the 6 to 8 win range, just below what I believe their win total will be in around 8.5. And after them, the controversy does not end in this video. It is the Miami Hurricanes. Now, obviously, they just made the national championship. They're coming off a program high in what is the last 10, 15, probably 20 years overall. But the problems they face coming into 2026 are a lot like Alabama's. They lose a ton of production on the offensive line, including Francis Maui-Noah, Inez Cooper, Brockermeyer, Markel Bell, all guys who are all conference caliber players, especially Francis Maui-Noah, who's projected to be in the top 15 probably in the NFL draft, definitely in the first round. Hard to replace that kind of talent on the offensive line, but they still do have talent overall. Don't want to say they don't. They have Malachi Toney. They bring in Darian Mensah and Cooper Barkate from Duke. And of course, they do add talent at offensive line. They bring in a 5-star in Jackson Cantwell. But this is a team that revolved around their offensive line in 2025. Like I said, they're still talented, but there is a larger success variable with them bringing in a bunch of new guys, especially a true freshman who is likely to start at left tackle. And it's more of the same on the defensive side of the ball. They lose Ruben Bain Jr., who's probably a top 3 pick in the NFL draft, David Blay, Akeem Mesidor, Wesley Besainth, Jacoby Thomas, Keontae Scott. The list just goes on. Now, obviously, in the portal era, it is easier to bring in talent to replace those guys. It's easier to bring in production, to bring in depth for those guys as well. But I am of the opinion that the offensive and defensive lines will probably take at least a small step back. I still think, obviously, they will be a good team overall. But with their national championship appearance, I think that juices their preseason win total this year. They probably end up in the 10.5 win range. They don't have a super tough schedule in the ACC, but they didn't really last year either, and they still lost 2 ACC games. There's still going to be plenty of teams in the ACC who are able to compete at the top of their conference. Like I said, I think their preseason win total ends up at around 10.5, but I think Miami takes a step back, looks closer to how they did in 2024, and ends up in the 8 to 9, maybe 10 win range. And after them, we have the Baylor Bears of the Big 12, alliteration there, BBB. And this one may actually come as a surprise because they were relatively mid in 2025, so not a ton of people are high on them coming into 2026. But with that, they lose Sawyer Robertson. They lose their top 5 producers at wide receiver, as well as their top running back from last year. Also, overall, as a unit, their defense regressed last season from the seasons prior under Dave Aranda. Now, they do bring in Joe Klanderman, who I am relatively high on at defensive coordinator. I think they probably improve as a defense, but I don't think they finish inside the top half of the Big 12 in year 1 with Klanderman. And obviously, like I said, they lose that production on offense. They bring in some, including former 5-star quarterback DJ Lagway from Florida, but this is a guy who is a lot more volatile, in my opinion, than Sawyer Robertson last year. He was pure chaos at Florida, sometimes looking good, sometimes having a 5 turnover game. So now he could still be effective. I don't want to just write him off automatically, especially if they flip him to maybe a pro spread style offense, but he still has a ton to prove both as a quarterback and as a pure passer. And overall, with what they brought in, I think they could be a bowl eligible type of team. I don't think they're just awful. They definitely have a lot of talent on their roster, but the biggest thing for the Baylor Bears this year is they have an absolute nightmare, absolute gauntlet schedule in 2026. They open the 2026 season against Auburn at a neutral site, a game they lost last year, who brings in a new head coach this year who's going to be revamped this year, probably a lot better in all honesty. At home, they face Colorado, TCU, Iowa State, and Texas Tech, which doesn't sound that bad. But then on the road, Arizona State, Kansas, UCF, BYU, and Houston. There's about 5 teams that they play in conference who I project will probably end in the top half of the Big 12. And I think with that schedule and with the 2025 results coming into play for this preseason win total, I think they land anywhere from 5.5 to 6.5 projected wins next year. And in year 1 with their new defensive coordinator, as long as a potentially way more volatile offense, I think that could spell disaster for this team in 2026. I have them finishing in the 3 to 5 win range. And last in this video, it is the North Carolina Tar Heels, another team that didn't perform well last year. So you might be wondering, how could you be any lower on this team? But they do have a lot of hype going into 2026, like they did in 2025, bringing in Bobby Petrino as their new offensive coordinator. Now, I don't want to disregard this move. I think it is a solid move. They will probably be a lot better schematically as an offense. But overall, in terms of the talent they're going to have on offense, they are very, very inexperienced going into 2026. They are 108th in returning snaps on offense. They undergo an entire offensive line overhaul. They bring in a decent amount of talent through the portal, but it's not like world beaters that they bring in. It's mainly power 4 underutilized or backup talent. So despite them bringing in Petrino, I'm not super hyped on them overall as an offense, but in 2025, they were very solid defensively, but once again, in that regard, they do lose a ton of production, especially on the front 7. They lose guys in DeAndre Robinson, CJ Mims, Tyler Thompson, Mekhi Bayer, Kamori House, who was their top tackler in 2025. So once again, going to have to overhaul that front 7, prove they are able to consistently win on the defensive side of the ball. And on top of that, like it is for so many of these teams, they face a very tough schedule this year in 2026. They face TCU in Ireland in week 0, which is always just a cursed matchup. Someone ends up coming out of that just looking absolutely down bad. On the road, they face Clemson, Pitt, Duke, UConn, who is always a pretty decent team in the group of 5, and Virginia, who was just in the conference title game. And then at home, Notre Dame, ouch, Miami, ouch, Louisville, and NC State. Very, very difficult schedule for the Tar Heels this year. I think with the hype surrounding this program, with the hype that they will improve offensively, now that Bobby Petrino is there, they end up in the preseason win total range of about 6.5. But once again, in 2026, I predict them to fall in the about 4 to 5 win range overall. And like last week, I noticed a trend with a lot of these teams. If you lose a lot of production up front, I am not going to be very confident in you as a team overall. The offensive lines and the defensive lines are where games are won. And unfortunately for a lot of these teams, I don't think they necessarily get better at either of those areas. And with that, thank you for watching. As always, be sure to like and subscribe. It helps me out a ton. Be sure to tune into next week's video and I will see you there.